Just days before Christmas, a California man allegedly murders his 1-year-old son and beheads the young boy in what first responders are calling a gruesome and horrific crime. The details of the case are almost too intense to believe. According to investigators, authorities in Sacramento, California received an emergency call at about 4:15 a.m. on December 20th. When sheriff's deputies arrived at the home, they found a young woman and her mother outside, reporting a domestic violence incident with her husband. Investigators quickly identified this man as 28-year-old Andrey Demskiy. The woman reported Demskiy had gotten violent with both her and her mother, so they ran from the house fearing for their lives. When deputies tried to arrest Demskiy, he refused to answer the door and even locked himself inside. But soon the stakes were raised. First responders learned his 1-year-old son Micah was also inside the home. Almost right away, deputies say they feared for the young boy's safety and thought he may be injured after Demskiy threw him across a room. Sheriff's deputies say Demskiy was uncooperative and became physically resistive when they entered the home, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. In the bedroom, first responders found a devastating scene. 1-year-old Micah had been murdered and his head cut from his body. Investigators believe Demskiy used a knife to carry out this gruesome crime. First responders say it was one of the most horrific things they'd ever seen, and many were visibly shaken. Demskiy was ultimately taken into custody and charged with murder, assault using force likely to cause great bodily injury, causing injury to a spouse or cohabitant, and assault resulting in the death of a child under 8 years of age. He appeared in court just this week, where local TV stations reported he had a large smile on his face during the hearing. Demskiy's public defender argued he has clear mental health issues and are requesting a full psychiatric evaluation. Meanwhile, he's been placed in psychiatric treatment in jail because he's ineligible for bond. As for 1-year-old Micah, a GoFundMe page for his family has already raised nearly $100,000. According to the page, quote, "The sweet little boy was a kind and joyful soul, loving all people and especially dogs. His kind heart and beautiful smile warmed the hearts of anyone he came in contact with. He loved his family and especially his mama. He loved being with family, going to the park, and singing hymns with his family." Now, this story is so heartbreaking, but we've got to bring in criminal defense attorney Mike Koribanics to break it all down for us. Mike, thanks for coming on to talk about a really difficult topic today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so murder is obviously the most intense crime that you can commit. Terrible, awful under any circumstance. But to me, it's even more intense when we talk about murdering your own child. And an added layer to this, beheading your own child, allegedly. I mean, what do you make of that right from the jump?
This is something that the first thing that comes into my head, especially as a defense attorney, is you have to have some sort of psychological evaluation to see where this person's mind was at. Plus, this is so complex since the child's mother ran out of the house with her mother and the child left behind. I think this has a lot of investigation that needs to be done as to how this all came about.
And I believe that it started with a domestic violence incident. You mentioned the mother of the child and her mother, so the wife and the mother-in-law had an incident, called 911. Is this something that we occasionally see, a domestic violence incident that turns even more intense into murder?
Well, I've heard of it, but I've never really seen it like this, where the child is left behind and the child is the victim, the biggest victim here, by the child only being, I believe, 1 year old, a 1 year old child being killed by the father, and the mother-in-law having to run out of the house. Now, I mean, I'm sure the investigation is going to show us more of a time frame, but obviously there was a concern because my understanding is the mother is the one who called the mother of the child was the one who called the police. So it appears she did everything she could to protect her family.
Yeah, you're right. I think she did everything correctly, removing herself from the situation, calling the authorities right away. But it is strange that the father, the husband, got in an argument with his wife and then basically takes it out on the child. Is this something that prosecutors are going to highlight? He got in this incident with his wife and his mother-in-law and then brought an innocent young 1-year-old child into the mix.
Well, that's going to be a very critical issue in this as to how it developed and how it went from the mother and the mother-in-law to the child. And I think there's just going to have to be a lot more investigation here to see what exactly the sequential process was in all of this.
If we're talking about the timeline, when things start right at the top, it's around 4 o'clock in the morning. We get a 911 call, first responders come, and they go to the door. And the suspect in this case does not allow them in. He's very uncooperative, locks the door, doesn't really want to speak with first responders. Are you surprised by that, that he wasn't very cooperative at the start?
I'm not really surprised at it, especially since he committed a murder, because at this point in time, I mean, he's got the presumption of innocence. I'm just speaking here just as different ways to look at it. But it would be unusual, especially if your child was hurt, perhaps by accident or something happened wrong. You would think you'd want to get whoever could help you into that house. And that's going to be very strong against him, the fact he was so much fighting against the police entering his home.
Hey, all you business owners or anyone who wants to start a side hustle, I have to take a quick second and tell you about something that can seriously level up your business game. It's odoo.com and their incredible accounting app. You know how keeping track of finances can get messy and even confusing? Well, Odoo makes it super simple. With their accounting app, you can manage invoices, expenses, and even get financial reports all in one place. Look at this clean interface. It's designed to save you time and reduce headaches. You can automate those repetitive tasks, which means you'll have more time to focus on what you really love, growing your business. So if you want to take control of your finances and make your accounting life a whole lot easier, check out Odoo's accounting app at our link odoo.com/lcnews28 and try Odoo for free today. It's been really striking to do research about this case too, because when you hear from the sheriff's deputies who entered the home, they're talking about it being the most gruesome scene they've ever seen. They're still visibly shaken up by this because obviously we have a victim who's only 1 year old, and to be beheaded is almost unimaginable. But if this case does go to jury trial, do you think that their testimony, talking about what they see when they first come into the crime scene, is going to be really invaluable?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to be devastating because, like you said, I can never recall hearing of someone being beheaded. That seems like something you read when you're in high school in some sort of novels you had to read for English courses or things like that. It just seemed like something so non-realistic. But a 1 year old to be beheaded is just amazing.
And the fact that we have this young kid who was innocent in all of this is just devastating for the little boy and his family. Talking about the father in all of this, though, he has appeared in court since. And something that jumped out to me right away is that local reporters told local TV stations he was in there and he had a huge smile on his face for his initial court appearance, talking about the murder and beheading of his 1 year old child. That stood out to me right away. What do you make of that?
That's really off the charts, quite frankly. It's something you would, as counsel, I think I would advise him to just maintain your face to be a neutral site, not to go one way or another in this, because just to smile while in court over something like this clearly shows there has to be some sort of mental health evaluation.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You brought that up earlier in the interview, and his defense has brought that up too. He is a public defender discussing the potential for mental health issues. Obviously, this is a crazy crime and potentially could have a mental health defense. What would all of that look like?
Well, it would look like that perhaps he had such a mental breakdown that he didn't have the ability to cause an intentional action, and this was just a breakdown that he didn't realize was happening because he had the mental breakdown. So there was no intention in doing what he did. It was almost like a blackout where you don't even know what happened. But that would take some very good experts and some large amount of time to evaluate something like this.
And I want to make sure I understand this completely. It would be that he didn't have the mental capacity at the time of the crime. So, at the time of the murder, at the time of the dismemberment, at that point, he was out of his mind, so to speak. Not before, not after how he's feeling now, but right in the time of the crime.
Well, it would be quite intricate to see if it happened at that point in time, or was this sort of a breakdown that was happening step by step, and all of a sudden it reached the goal where he did not realize what he did, or I mean, or could it be that he did know what he did, he just lost his temper, and he did this to show perhaps his wife and his mother-in-law that he was in charge of everything, which could be a very sick way to do this, but would not actually give the sort of that you weren't mentally capable of not knowing what you were doing.
So, how does the defense go forward with proving that? I'm sure they would go through all of his medical history. And you mentioned talking about some of the experts who may testify. What would that part look like?
Well, it would take quite a bit of time because you would need so many different type of examinations, but the defense would need to get a mental health expert to evaluate him based upon his present state of mind, what happened a few days ago, and if in fact he had some mental health issues prior to this coming up. So it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that takes some time.
Talking about the other people who are involved in all of this, we have the mother in law and the mother of this young boy who were right there when it happened. What about their testimony? Would that be really helpful for the prosecution too?
Depending upon what they saw, but I mean, it obviously would be helpful in the fact I in the fact that they would be able to testify how this went step by step and how he was losing his temper and intimidating them that they had to run out of the house. But one of the questions would be, if you were so afraid, how could you leave your 1 year old child behind? And that's something that we need to just know more investigation on.
More investigation. I know that the authorities in California are saying we're just in the early stages. It hasn't even been a week since this tragedy occurred. And you've mentioned this a couple of times. What do you think this sort of investigation would look like? I mean, in the cases we cover now, it's pretty much always cell phones. They're probably going to look at the locations, call logs, maybe even social media. But what do you think this early on investigation would call for?
Well, the most important thing would be the interviewing of the mother and her mother who ran out of the house and what exactly occurred prior to there, and where was the location of the child when this first started, and how did this come about.
Do you think they would also look into the past relationship? This was a married couple, so obviously they've been together for a while. They share a son, so they have this intimate relationship. Would they go and look into the files, so to speak? Were there ever any warning signs? Was he violent in the past? Did he ever make threats? Things like that?
Oh, absolutely. We'd look to see if there's any domestic violence, any prior restraining orders, any cases that, many times in domestic violence cases, you'll see where, the family has a disagreement, but they go through therapy and things of that nature to get back on track as a family. Did that happen? Because they obviously were together when this occurred. So these are things that need to be looked at, and there'll probably be a lot of document and prior history searches into this case by the government.
I think all in all, this is just a really tragic case, a tough one to talk about. Mike, thanks for coming on and breaking it down with us.
Thank you for having me.
Andrey Demskiy is due back in court on March 13th. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.